My name's Fred D'Agostino, and I'm the Master of Ceremonies for this evening's event. I'm very happy to, indeed proud to be associated with it. It's a joint venture of the Australian Academy of the Humanities, many of whose fellows are here tonight, and the Australian Dialogues, which is an organization which started out in Brisbane, which is going national this year, and which I'm also have the honor to be associated with. And as a preliminary, please allow me on your behalf, on behalf of all those present, to acknowledge the traditional custodians of place and culture where we gather this evening. Thanks for your interest, not just in the topic, although it's fascinating, but as importantly in the idea that there can be civil and probing discussion of lively issues, even indeed of potentially divisive issues. The Australian Dialogues concept, which will be embodied here this evening, is a response to the increasing polarization of discussion in societies like ours, luckily not as polarized in Australia as it is elsewhere. I hope that we can show you a good example of how to have a good discussion about potentially controversial issues. Certainly we have a good topic, and we have some highly competent people to talk about it. If you want to know more about Australian Dialogues, check out that handle, Australian Dialogues, on social media and YouTube. Another crucial preliminary, which we call the Brisbane Rule, since the dialogue started there, is this. All participants, and that includes you as well, audience, agree to listen carefully, to speak respectfully, and to concentrate on the substance. So we play the ball, not the bowler, in the Australian Dialogues. Let the silence do the heavy lifting, some Brisbane elders have told us. Deep inner listening and quiet, still awareness will endeavor to show that tonight in our discussion. And before introducing the topic and the panelists, some housekeeping. Do please keep your mobile phones on, because they will be the medium through which you communicate to me the questions that you would like to address to the panelists. But make sure that they're on mute. Fire exits are clearly marked, back, side. I don't know where the restrooms are, although I'm supposed to tell you that. Does anybody know? They're out that way, okay? And it's a little crowded, but you're free to move around, to go to the bar to get some more tucker. There is still some more over on the sideboard, but please try to do so unobtrusively. The event is being recorded, and it will be published online in due course. Our topic today is the state of the arts in the lucky country. Who cares? Why bother? These are questions which are timely, and indeed, and alas, they are perpetually timely, not least because there's persistent disagreement about the function of the arts in our society, and in addition about the role of the government in nurturing and sustaining the arts. Sometimes the arts are seen as good in their own terms, ars gratia artis, in the cynical motto of the movie studio MGM. Both Malcolm Fraser and Anthony Albanese seem to have held some version of this idea, associating it with the project of nation building. Sometimes the arts are seen as part of and evaluated in terms of their contributions to the national economy. Paul Keating may not have coined the phrase, but he certainly talked about the creative industries and saw them as a crucial sector in the post-industrial economy, as more recently has the Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young. It's interesting in this regard that 2024 is the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the Elizabethan Trust, one of H.C. Coombs' many legacies to the nation, which embodied the nation-building idea about the arts, and indeed is responsible for the formation of most of the major national companies. And it's also the 30th anniversary of Creative Nation, which expressed instead the idea that the arts are a sector in the national economy. And whatever their purpose, there's the matter of how they're to be supported and by whom. Again, there is persistent disagreement, masked perhaps by some superficial agreement on the proposition that there must be a balancing, anyway, of the three primary sources of support for the arts. The audience, which pays by buying tickets, the government, which pays through subsidies and tax benefits, and increasingly, though in Australia still fitfully, philanthropy, which plays a bigger and more established role in other jurisdictions and plays a bigger role in some of the arts in Australia than it does in others of them. Anyway, these are the matters that we're here to discuss, and indeed for the audience, to help us discuss when we get towards the end of the event to the Q&A. Now, the Q&A, as I've already indicated, will be you text me and I ask them. This is partly to allow some curation so that we don't just get kind of random things happening, but it's partly also to make sure that we can answer as many questions as possible. I think the number is the number. The number will come. So you all have my phone number now. I'm just a little nervous about this. So my mother doesn't have my phone number. So anyway, let me introduce our panel. First of all, we're in the highly competent hands of Kelly Burke, arts journalist for The Guardian Australia. And she'll be our moderator tonight and will lead the panelists through a series of issues that will, we hope, illuminate the topic and provoke thought and discussion. Kelly's the 2021 Walkley Award winner for her arts journalism and previously won the Australian Council of Deans of Education Award for the most outstanding contribution to education journalism. She's been media advisor to the New South Wales government and in the Commonwealth Parliament. Thank you, Kelly, for joining us. Ian Walker was Brisbane managing partner and national board member of the law firm Norton Rose Fulbright before being elected as a Queensland state MP from 2012 to 2017, during which period he was Minister for Science, IT, Innovation, and the Arts. The arts always get lumped in with three other things. And of course, the humanities don't get lumped in with anything, so I guess the arts are one up on us. These kinds of portfolios are sometimes known in Queensland as the Russ Hinds portfolios. And he previously chaired the board of Camerata, Queensland's chamber orchestra, and is now president of Queensland Youth Orchestras. Lyndon Terracini, AM, was the artistic director, I should say, commendatore. Lyndon Terracini, AM, was the artistic director of Opera Australia from 2009 until 2022. He remodeled that company to connect it to a much wider public. During that period, Opera Australia more than doubled its turnover and tripled the size of its audience. His stewardship of the Northern Rivers Performing Arts, which he founded, and of the Queensland Music Festival and the Brisbane Festival, have also been hallmarks of his philosophy and success. Prior to his work as an artistic director and CEO, he was an internationally acclaimed operatic baritone. Thank you for joining us, Lyndon. Karen Hans is program coordinator and lecturer in creative industries at the University of the Sunshine Coast. Her research focuses on how policy shapes the conditions of creative and cultural workers, value in creative industries, and how writing and publishing contributes to dynamic cities and communities. Karen is a fellow of the Higher Education Academy. She previously was associate publisher of Griffith Review and is a peer reviewer for the Australia Council. I now turn matters over to the panel and ask Kelly Burke to initiate our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. After that fabulous introduction, I don't need to do one. So we might just go straight into the first question, which is a very general one for each of you to answer. What are the arts for, and why do they deserve public funding?
Well, I always, because the arts are such a broad thing, Kelly, I always define it as the thing that makes life worth living. And for me, that's what it is. I think it's such an essential part of our own lives and of the community's life, and of making life worthwhile. So that's where I start. So for me, that's why it's important. Why is it important for the community and for governments to fund it, or for anyone to fund it? Because I think within the community, it's important to have a community that is entertained. That sounds a very surface level thing, but I think that is important. Entertained, elevated, informed, and I think the arts does a lot of that. So I think it's important for governments to ensure that that part of our community living is alive and well.
I think the arts at its most granular level is about sharing stories, and when we are able to do that, we bring people together, we learn, we're forewarned, we can reflect, it unites us, we kind of build this sense of social cohesion, which I guess leans into the whole other instrumentalist side of the arts, well-being, health, urban development and so on. I think it's important that the arts are funded because they can't survive without government funds. If we leave the arts to the free market, then all kinds of crazy stuff happens. And it's almost like we need a government to tell us it's good for us.
Well, I think, I don't know whether this is, it is on. Look, I should just say, I'm not wearing sunglasses for any particular effect.
Rockstar, Lyndon.
What people may think. It's I've got a burst capillary in my eye, and so it's pretty ugly to look at, so I'm sparing you that. Look, I think, music, and particularly opera, but I played a lot of jazz and sang in television shows and popular music a lot too in my 30 years as a singer, which is the way I earned my living. The incredible thing is how the power of music can change someone's life, and how you see what happens when people are striving to make the best art that they can, how that affects people. And ideally, it means that they have a better life. It means that the society that they live in is a different sort of society. And so it's vitally important, I think, for in my case, music and the making of the performing arts exists, and not only exists but thrives in a climate that can be, particularly hostile at the moment. Whether or not that should be funded by governments, I'm not sure now. I'm not sure how that will all pan out, and I'm not sure whether that is the best system. If you have a look at the United States, where there's no government funding, I would argue that the most successful classical composer in the last 40 or 50 years is Philip Glass, an American, who wasn't funded by any form of government agency. But look, I'm sure that's not what most people would think about how the making of art should be funded. But I think it's worth some sort of discussion.
Point about the joy that comes from art, and particularly music. One of the interesting things for me is at Queensland Youth Orchestra, we've got 550 kids who competitively audition, and they are fastidious and concentrating on getting the excellent note and the perfect C sharp. But we get them together with Access Arts, which is a group which looks to disabled people or disadvantaged people, to having them perform. And the combination of when we get them together is a marvellous thing. You've got these kids who are striving for excellence, but then are performing with people for whom just getting up on the stage and expressing themselves is of the essence of their life and being. And it's a fantastic thing to see, and a learning experience for both of them, I think, as to how the arts can be such a field of excellence and wonder, and yet how it can be a field of enjoyment and involvement and wonder. I think that sort of breadth is what the arts can add to a society.
Yeah, I think just to pick up on that, the Queensland Youth Orchestra was set up in a wonderful way by John Currow, without any government money. It was just, for kids to be able to play and really play to an extremely high level. And the Queensland Youth Orchestra does play at that level. I remember one of the festivals in Brisbane, I was doing Tristan and Isolde, big Wagner opera. And there were some difficulties with the Queensland Orchestra at that time. So I got the Queensland Youth Orchestra to play it. And they had a huge success and they were wonderful. And it's so fantastic to see all these kids playing as if their lives depended on it, And the response from the audience then is just it's ecstatic. It's an extraordinary thing. It's a wonderful thing.
Arts at the grassroots level is something we'll go into a bit more detail later on because it is so vitally important. But Karen, there's something that you said that I wanted to pick up on. You essentially said that we need the government to tell us what's good for us.
Yes, we do.
Ian, what do you think about that?
Well, it's an interesting one. I think I don't particularly like governments telling me much. However, I take Karen's point to an extent, and I've read something that you wrote about this, Karen, and there is a point there. The difficulty, I think, is that whatever happens, whether it's philanthropists or government, in the end, whoever pays the piper is going to call the tune. And that applies to the arts, of course, we're playing tunes. But it's very difficult. You can imagine some of the controversial issues, for example, that the federal government's been pushing in recent years, which I think has meant that artists have felt perhaps necessary to take a particular point of view on certain issues to assist with their funding. And I'm not pointing at this particular government. I think it's whichever government's in power. So I think it's a very dangerous thing for governments to be calling the tune. I think there's a necessity, however, for governments to give a lead. And I think in the end, what's important is that there's various sources of funding, so that we have philanthropists, we have governments. There's not one source of funding upon whom everyone relies, because that is dangerous. But I think if the government is providing some funding and if philanthropists are providing other, that helps minimise the risk of artists not having the freedom to express themselves as they might really want to.
So can I just clarify something there? In the Australian funding system, the government, unless you are Brandis, circa 2015, the government doesn't decide what gets funded, with the exception of a handful of major performing arts organisations. So the process is what we call arm's length, peer review process, where individuals and organisations can apply for funding, and it obviously behooves those individuals and organisations to apply for funding that might be a priority of the government of the day. So at the moment we have the quite good 7.5 out of 10 Revive cultural policy, where the government has set out a number of priorities for the arts sector, and as the name Revive suggests, it's to kind of lift the arts sector out of the post-pandemic slump and kind of set the tone or the agenda for the future. So at the moment, I suppose the priorities in there, they've got 5 pillars, and the government is or has invested in a number of those 5 pillars. So we're seeing some separate councils set up, such as the workplaces councils, to, I guess, investigate, possibly regulate creative careers, creative workplaces. But it's certainly not the government deciding what artists can and can't do.
Oh, that's true to an extent, Karen, but there are other pillars set out in that, and they set a political agenda, and it's quite proper for the government to do that. But then that does channel arts expression into certain areas that the creative person mightn't want to do, but they know where they have to go to get the dough. That I think is where the rubber hits the road. Lyndon's had experience with this.
Look, if I can say there's one, what I think is a fantastic initiative by Creative Australia, formerly the Australia Council, and that is the Australian Cultural Fund. So that if someone wants to make a donation, get a full tax deduction, then they can do it through the Australian Cultural Fund directed to a particular organisation. So, for example, I've started this new opera festival in Millthorpe for next Easter, imaginatively titled Opera at Millthorpe. And
That's
so
a creative.
it is.
Creative.
Well, it's actually Handa Opera at Millthorpe because I've
well
found
thought through, yeah.
Dr. Handa is putting some money in. So there are donors who are contributing towards that through the Australian Cultural Fund. But I was thinking the other day, well, why would that have to go through Creative Australia? Why doesn't that just go a straight donation and then the tax department say, well, you don't pay any tax? It seems to me that it creates an extra level that I don't think is necessary.
Do you think it's because there needs to be some sort of oversight? I'm just thinking about what's happened since the Gaza conflict. A lot of arts organisations, particularly those down in Melbourne, have lost philanthropic money because they've taken a particular stand on the Gaza conflict. Where do you draw the line with philanthropic money as to who calls the shots on how you behave and what you stage? And are we becoming more conservative to make sure that we keep our donors happy?
Well, I can speak from experience in that I've only ever had one instance where it was hinted at fairly strongly that perhaps a particular donor would be given a particular role within the context of an organisation, and I managed to work around that. It was never raised again, and it never happened again. I think sometimes people will try it on, but that's when you just have to say, well, that's not the case, and we're not going to do that.
I mean, my view would be if the philanthropist is contributing, then the philanthropist got an interest in the approach that the entity takes. I think Lyndon's quite right. That doesn't mean that he rings up and says, I want this line taken out of the play or whatever. But if on assessment the philanthropist says, well, I don't like the way this company's heading and I'm not going to give that way, well, that may be her right to do next time round. So that's a free market sort of situation. Can I go back a bit to what Karen said? Because I do agree that there is still a role for the government to come in and fill some of the gaps that philanthropists don't, and to give some direction in that way. But I think the government's got to be very careful that that they in turn don't become the tune caller, and that they're setting an agenda that arts organisations feel they have to jump to.
So is it becoming more difficult to do something risky or to do something challenging because we are having to rely more on philanthropy? And then when you've got a complex issue like Woodside in Western Australia, who are now pulling out, I mean, who do you take money from? Who don't you take money from? All these competing demands, does it mean that they're affecting what we program, what audiences see is being affected by this?
Well, I think film is a really good example for this. I mean, people who want to make a movie, as they've done for years and years and years, they go out and find the money so that they can do it. And some of that may come from the Australian Film Commission in Australia, but initially they're finding investors so they can make the film. I guess that means you've got to find the right investors. Some investors, wouldn't be interested in, putting money into, I don't know, whatever movie. Whereas others would be very enthusiastic about it because it is a bit edgy, because it does have something important to say about our society now. Whereas others would prefer to put their money into a costume drama. So I think it's really picking your mark and going after it as much as you possibly can, and convincing people that their money will be well spent.
Can I just address the question of risk? Now, Lyndon, you've had experience programming organisations. I haven't, so I'll put my hand out there. But I think in terms of organisations programming things that are challenging is becoming less and less likely. We're almost in this trap where we want the arts to excite us and challenge us and throw up a mirror so that we're seeing possibly the more shocking, confronting aspects of our lives or humanity, but we don't want to pay for it. And that's a really dangerous situation. And I think that's where, when I say lightheartedly, we need the government to tell us what's good for us. We actually do need that kind of investment. Otherwise, our new writers, our new actors, our new performers are not going to get their time on the stage because audiences are immune to risk. We know through Netflix programming, all the statistics on what we're currently watching, we want comfort. We don't want to be shocked anymore. We want to feel good about ourselves, good about our day, and we're increasingly returning to reruns or remakes of known formulas for our entertainment. So if we have the arts in a free market economy that we're discussing up here, that kind of opens it up for risk. No one will pay for it, and if we're going to rely completely on the free market, it means that inevitably those companies will run dry.
I think that's true, but I think, Karen, that can be modified a bit if, when I was sitting in the chair, one of the things we tried to steer organisations to was a model of a third of their income from tickets or their own sales, a third from philanthropists, a third from the government. And that sort of modifies the risk a bit, because there's equally the risk of offending the government and not being able to say what you want to say. I think another part of it is that what audience want and what artists often think they're delivering are two very different things. And you made that point as you went through. Tchaikovsky, when he wrote the 1812 Overture, thought he was, giving us a panorama of that fantastic victory. But for the punters in the seats, it's just a good tune to whistle on the way home. So he thinks he's communicating one thing, but the punters are receiving something quite different. So, to the extent you've got to strip back the romanticism a bit and get back to the reality, particularly if you're a politician, I suppose, and you're going to the Treasurer looking for money. In the end, it is, well, what benefit is that going to give the people in the seats, rather than what glow is it going to give the artist on stage, thinking that he's communicated this wonderful political idea.
So, Ian, are you saying that we should give the punters what they want? I mean, surely that will mean we'll get all musical theatre and no opera. We'll get all live pop concerts and no chamber music.
Yeah, no, good point. No, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that's got to be a large part of the decision. Because if you're not giving the punters what they want, well, I don't think that you are, as a society, delivering the necessary arts experience to them. But you've at the same time got to challenge them, and you do have to confront them. And so again, it's, I suppose, maybe the traditional politician's position of a middle position. But I think all of one thing or all of the other is disaster. But an appropriate mix is important. But I would certainly say you can't disregard, as a bulk of what you're thinking, what it is that your audience wants. And I mean, Lyndon, you've had to deal with this in practical terms, and your runs are on the board from what Fred said. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think too, and I take Karen's point, but we're living in a much more conservative time now than we have probably in my lifetime. It's not like, for those of us who can still remember them, it's not like the 1970s. Where, everything was happening and some of it was pretty terrible, but there were some amazing things coming out too. And it was a very stimulating, exciting time. And for whatever reason, we're now already in a very conservative time, and I think it'll become even more conservative. A couple of the elections that have taken place very recently are key pointers to that. And that means that audiences are really demanding that what you're presenting is more conservative. And to Ian's point, if nobody's turning up, then you've got a serious problem. And it's about trying to find that balance. At Opera Australia, with every company I've run, it was really thinking about that from the very beginning. Have we got the balance right? Are we balancing the program? Have we got the balance right in terms of government subsidy and so on and so on? In the end, at Opera Australia, we were earning 80% of our total budget, which is, a huge amount. But we had to survive. If we weren't earning that, well, the company would have been in serious trouble. So the whole thing is, it's balancing all the time, balancing the feeling in the community, how conservative it is. Would they take a risk on this if we put something else in that was more appealing to them, so we can do the risky pieces? Constantly, it's really trying to figure out what that balance is, and that can be very difficult.
So
You took a strong stand on that, and I expect. You were running South Pacific to pay for on Yagan,
Exactly.
But that wasn't without controversy or difficulty internally, I expect.
No, absolutely. I mean, the point was that there wasn't the audience for the number of operas we were doing in Sydney. But we didn't want to lose the Sydney Opera House, because if you've got the Sydney Opera House, then you've got 30% of your audience are tourists. So you don't want to lose that. So when we started doing big musicals that I felt an opera company should do, and South Pacific is a good example. Ezio Pinza, one of the greatest bassists who ever lived, bass at the Metropolitan Opera, he sang Emile de Becque on Broadway. And so there was a very strong connection there, and a very strong connection with Australia. The map of Australia is as part of the set. And that did wonderful business, and was able to pay for the Nose on Yagan and various other things. Without that, we wouldn't have been able to do those pieces, and we would have just tried to save and save and save, and then everything gets smaller and smaller, and ultimately the public notices that, and they don't want to buy a ticket. The only way to compete with, as Kelly was saying, with musicals, you go to a musical, it is huge. The set is huge. The whole thing is enormous. And then if they're coming to the opera and you've got a three-hander, then they're not prepared to pay more money for an opera ticket than they're paying at the musical. So again, you've got to figure out what that balance is and try and manage it. And that's the difficulty of running one of those large companies. It's constantly trying to have your finger on the pulse of what's happening in the community. Is it veering to be more risky? Is it becoming more conservative? And they're the things you've got to consider all the time.
Lyndon, you said that audiences were becoming more conservative.
Oh, I think all of society is more conservative.
So I'm just wondering if that's the correct adjective, and populist might be more appropriate, because when you look at what are traditionally seen as the conservative art forms, opera would be one, symphonic music would be another. Audiences are dwindling for those.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. They're dwindling in the Western, not in the Western world, in the English-speaking world. They're in opera and symphonic music. There's no doubt it's in decline. And so, and my feeling is one of the reasons I started this festival. I think people will go to festivals, and they'll go to festivals where it's operatic music, chamber music, and so on. They won't go to a festival of a musical. Musicals don't work in festivals, so you don't do that. But I think they do work, or opera and chamber music do work in festivals. So I think that's a path for the future. But in terms of the way opera is being presented in the English-speaking world, it's absolutely going down the wrong path. At Opera Australia, by the time I left, we had audiences over 650,000 people a year, and we had a turnover of 130 million. Well, we were pulling every string we could and keeping our hand on the tiller, trying to work out, would this work? Will this work in Melbourne? No, but it might work in Sydney. Would it work in Brisbane? Yes, but it won't work in Melbourne. And all of those things, because the audience is very different. And, the cultures of the cities are different. We can say we're all Australians. Well, we are, but, the culture of Melbourne is very different to the culture of Brisbane. And you've got to think about that when you're programming and how you're selling tickets. And so, as I said, I think there needs to be a reassessment of how the opera companies are working and how symphony orchestras are working.
Liz Patterson's from Sydney and Edna's from Melbourne. That shows the difference.
Karen, I'd like to pick up on something you said. You mentioned the streaming services and how we look to people like Netflix to give us comfort and to... I'd like to disagree with that, because the most successful Netflix series that has ever come out was Squid Game. And I don't know how many people of you have seen Squid Game, but I had to take a few days off work
it was horrific.
after binging on it.
Absolutely. I mean, I just couldn't watch it.
It was terrific.
I found it so cruel. It was awful.
So what does that say about us? We're not looking for comfort,
Well, it
are we?
says that there are a lot of fruitcakes out there.
I loved it, but I was traumatised by it.
I guess As a case in point, I think it was Disney or one of those big Pixar studio came out a couple of months ago to say that they were no longer commissioning new scripts. So instead, they were just going to be doing The Little Mermaid Part 7 because we're so adverse to risk at the moment.
I would like to add that also because the federal government has been dragging its heels on getting local content quotas in place for streamers, that the streamers are using their might to say, well, until we know what's going on, we're not going to plough any more money into Australia.
Kelly, can I just go back to your earlier point that you raised with Lyndon about dwindling audiences for the high arts particularly? I had an interesting study brought to me by my department when I was in the game, and that was to show worldwide trends. And the worldwide trend was opera and symphonic music declining, and gallery visits and museum visits increasing. And the interpretation of that was that people are concerned about going to the opera and the symphony orchestra about how they dress, when they clap. They've got to sit through something they don't like to wait for something they do like. Whereas visiting a museum or a gallery, you go in your jeans, you stop in front of a painting you like for as long as you like, and if you don't like it, you move on to something else. And that I thought was an interesting analysis of perhaps what the problem is. I don't know then how that Karen or Lyndon moves into action, but there may be something there.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure whether that analysis applied to Italy, for example. I suspect not, because despite all the doom and gloom about the Italian economy, opera in Italy, once again, is really booming. La Scala, again, is arguably the greatest opera house in the world. And if you think about it, from Milan to Venice, there are 10 full-time opera companies. I mean, it's, from here, not even from here to Sydney. And they function, and they function well within the chaotic system that is Italy. But
and who's their audience, Lyndon? Is it locals or tourists or a bit of each?
Mainly locals. In somewhere like Milan at La Scala, huge number of tourists. Venice, huge number of tourists. Rome, a lot of tourists. But it was interesting at Rome, and when I was talking about before about changing, opera companies changing what they do, the opera house in Rome used to close in the summer. When all the tourists were in town, they closed because that was their holiday. And I was trying to do a co-production with them, and I said, well, look, you can't function like this. When you've got millions of people in the city and you've shut the doors, it doesn't make any sense. Anyway, so they do have a limited season now in the summer.
But Lyndon, we're talking about in Italy, that is their homegrown culture.
It is, yeah.
Whereas we've imported that wholesale to Australia.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, have we done enough as Australians to carve out our own niche in that particular art form? You were saying, Ian, that the museum and gallery visitation is up. But is that because they are being more innovative? We're looking at immersive exhibitions now. We're looking at, this huge explosion and fascination with ancient Egypt, and the money's just rolling into our museums, and everything's interactive. Are they doing things that maybe opera, the symphony aren't doing?
Well, you don't pay $350 a ticket.
No.
And I think that's a really big thing. The cost of, we've all seen the news about the cost of living, and we all know how, families are struggling and all the rest of it. If they're looking at, spending, well, basically you go with someone, you park the car, you have dinner, there's $1,000 for the night. And I think people are really thinking, well, not even thinking, I think people just don't want to do that at the moment. It's far too expensive for them. And it is expensive.
Since the Australia Council was established 70-odd years ago, allegations of elitism come up regularly, including by a lot of politicians. Your time at Opera Australia, you must have had to deal with that allegation many, many times. What's your argument? What do you say to people?
Well, we did, have massive increases in audiences because we decided that there wasn't one audience. It was a number of different audiences. So we had to figure out how we could play to all of those different audiences, and they then made up, the whole. And again, that's just having a hand on the tiller all the time and trying to figure out what it is. But in terms of, if I can go back to innovation, the way to financial ruin in opera is to commission an Australian opera. And even Brett Dean, who's our most famous composer, we did Bliss, Brett's opera, and we had...
Jonathan's just gone in with Eucalyptus.
He has. I haven't seen the numbers on Eucalyptus, but for Bliss, 6,000 people in all of Australia, and including the Edinburgh Festival, bought a ticket. So that was a season in Sydney, a season in Melbourne, and Edinburgh. 6,000. When it was shown on television, it's the lowest rating show the ABC has ever had in its history.
But what about some of the 17th Doll? That's been successful, hasn't it?
Well, it is as a play, yeah, and I like it.
I'm talking about the opera.
Yeah, no, I like Richard's opera, the 17th Doll, but it's had limited seasons, and in the end, a very small number of people went to see it. So it's, but I'm not saying that audiences are completely averse to hearing an Australian story or anything like that. Not at all. I think that, in terms of Australian operas, has to do with the style of music that Australian composers adopted. And that was primarily a 12-tone technique that they'd taken from Schoenberg and everyone else. And it was very, very German and so on and so on. And audiences hated it. So it built up this feeling that if it's a new Australian opera, we went to that other one, it was terrible, we left at interval. Well, in all the research we did, we found if people didn't like a production, if they thought it was a hideous production, they would still come back and see the opera again. If they hated the music, they wouldn't come back. And that's our fault. The style of music that's been written has not been conducive to generating audiences.
Karen, we need accessibility and we need quality in our arts. How do we ensure that excellence without engaging in the vernacular of elitism?
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. I have a real issue with the term excellence when we associate it with the arts. I think it does suggest elitism to me, and I think the arts in Australia have always grappled with this idea of elitism, and I think that's possibly because of the high barrier point. So you were saying, which I found really interesting, and you said that was a worldwide trend of people no longer attending opera and symphony in high numbers, but they were opting to attend the galleries. And I do think that's because you do need a high level of education, or at least education in opera or classical music, to understand what is going on. There are conventions and cultures within opera that, to an outsider, it looks like another planet almost. Whereas the art galleries and museums, you can go when you want, dressed in your jeans, and as you were saying, spend as much time or as little time as you want there. I think with the opera, that's forcing people to be at a certain time and a certain place. And we've changed so much as a society that is a real challenge for most of us. Even if we do have the money to buy a ticket, even if we do have the time to go and see opera, we get to 5 o'clock in the afternoon and go, I can't do another thing today. I want to go home, or I'll watch it on Netflix.
In my pyjamas.
But not Squid Game.
But I think just in terms of elitism and excellence, I think the opposite of that, if I can talk in binaries for a moment, would be accessibility. And one of the great things about the arts, particularly the way it was set up in Australia, is that it should be a democracy. And accessibility is part and parcel of that, and it should be available to everyone. These high barriers that we have, whether that's tickets, whether it's everything being concentrated in a city, really is a preventative factor, I think, to people being involved.
Could I just respond to Karen? I'm not sure I agree with that, because I think Australians love elite athletes, and the shows, the games that are watched mostly, either State of Origin or a cricket test with Australia and England, the greatest, or the Olympics. The greatest athletes, the greatest players, and Australians love that. And they don't care what it costs. If you go to the grand final of the rugby league, it costs more than going to the opera. But rugby league has done a brilliant job in selling their product and selling it to a large number of people, as opposed to what's happening with rugby union. But what's happening with rugby union? Well, they're not winning. They won the other day for the first time in whenever. But that has been the problem. When they're not winning, nobody wants to go. And when we've had, you know, the greatest singers in the world, we've charged a lot of money. And the shows were sold out. Jonas Kaufmann, arguably the greatest opera singer alive now, he came to Melbourne and he sang in Lohengrin. It was a stage production, so he was in a stage production. We charged $750 a ticket and sold them because people wanted to see the best. And so, you know, La Scala, as I said, is a great opera house again now because they've got the best people. And the shows are fantastic. You go and you think, my God, this is just so uplifting, so inspiring. How can people do that? In the same way as you watch the Olympics and you think, how can human beings possibly do that? And it's so exciting, it's so uplifting, so inspiring, as I said. So I'm not sure that I agree with excellence not being important to Australians, or, you know, as I said, elitism. Elitism is different to elitist. It's an elite athlete is something to be admired. That doesn't necessarily mean what they're doing is elitist. So, and look, I know that's a question of semantics at the moment, but, you know, elite musicians, elite singers, elite athletes, for me, you know, they're the same thing, and they're wonders to behold.
Kelly, as a politician, there are two ends of the spectrum where you get trouble. Funding elite arts is difficult, and you get a lot of criticism. Why in the hell is my taxes going to pay for, you know, some smart-ass doctor to go to the opera when he could pay by himself? So you get a lot of that. And I do think there's an argument to meet that, because I do think it's important for those elements of our culture that have been an inherited crucial part of the culture that we are to be supported and continued. But that's a contestable debate. The other risky bit is the grassroots stuff, and that's important to fund as well. You've got to fund the new stuff, the risky stuff, the stuff that's, you know, may turn into something great. But that's risky because you put a bit of dough into a thing, you know, and it turns out to be terrible, or they all come out nude and the Courier Mail's got a, you know, whatever happens, you know, you are taking a risk.
I didn't know you came to my show.
I'm going back to the 70s.
Okay, but hold on there. So we've got this. You're saying that the grassroots is important. You're saying you've got to get the big names in to make the big money.
I think you need both.
Okay, so how do you get that balance right between, and I know Opera Australia has come in for criticism for that under your reign, that a lot of young up-and-coming Australian singers were not getting opportunities because of the influx of imported overseas stars.
Well, that was
were being
completely
used.
untrue, because we developed far more young Australian artists during my period than ever before in the company's history. So that was a furphy.
And just going back to sport, the Australian Bureau of Statistics has found that more than 80% of Australians attend at least one cultural event a year. And only something like, I think, 43 or 44% of Australians attend at least one major sporting event in a year. Why are we known as a nation of sports lovers when we attend more cultural events than we do sporting events?
That's true. The Queensland Art Gallery hosts 4 State of Origin crowds a year. So, you know, yet we think State of Origin's great, and it is. So there is an imbalance in the perception. I don't know why that is. I think, is it easy to change that perception? Probably not. And do we really need to worry about it so much? I don't really know. I think one of the things, Kelly, we haven't talked about, I think you started to touch on it there, is a lot of the discussion at the moment has really been about city dwellers who can go down to the opera house or the theatre, you know, catch the bus and have a great night out. We haven't really talked about delivering arts to people in Chinchilla or Udnadatta or Broome, and I think that's another important part of the discussion that, you know, we've got to meet in some way. And you know, there's some ironic things there, I think. I mean, Lyndon would know because he ran the Queensland Music Festival, but we had a Puccini program that we took around Queensland. The deal was that it'd have the principal singers from Queensland Opera, but each city it went to, Toowoomba through to Mount Isa, the local choir provided the chorus. And it was a huge success. There was great investment in it, drew great crowds. So again, it might even go back to answering your sport arts thing. It's a bit about how you package it. If you do package it in the right way, there's a lot of willingness and hunger out there for it. I had a good story when I was chairing Camerata. We took Camerata on a regional tour, and we ended up in Roma, which is a country Queensland town, at the Anglican Church Hall there, put on the concert. And a bloke came up to me, I was chairing it then, and said, "Mate, you think you've brought classical music to the bush tonight, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I suppose I do." He said, "You haven't, you know." He said, "You fed the starving tonight." He said, "I've never seen classical music performed in my own town before." He said he had his, I think, case of CDs with him that he listened to. But it just shows you, I think, how much we neglect rural and regional parts of Australia, and how easy it is for us to talk in a very city-based sort of way about these things without thinking about the
Linton,
rural.
is that what you're hoping to do at Millthorpe? Feed the starving?
Well, I think there are a number of things with this. I'm not a great fan of touring. I think there's a place for it, yeah, absolutely, but it shouldn't just be about touring. And Ian mentioned the Queensland Music Festival. When we did big productions in 13 cities, or towns and cities throughout Queensland during the festival, and every one of them was something that was created out of that place. So, for example, in Mount Isa, we did a big show called Bobcat Dancing, because Mount Isa is a big, heavy machinery town. So we had dancing bobcats and giant excavators doing a love duet. And it was a story about Mount Isa. Someone comes, "Oh, mate, I'm only going to stay 6 months, making a bit of dough, then I'm going to leave." 25 years later, they're still there. And so it was really about that. And 16,000 people over 3 nights in a town of 21,000 came to see the show. Why? Because it was about them. And in Charters Towers, we did Charters Towers the musical. In Rockhampton, I commissioned the first symphony ever written for any town or city in Australia. Elena Katz-Chernin wrote it, the Rockhampton Garden Symphony. And it was a wonderful event. And there was a local poet, Mark Svensson, and I remember the first line. It was a choral symphony. "I am the river and you are my people," was how it started. And we had the local choir. They've got a fantastic brass band, or they used to then, the Cap Silver Band. We had an orchestra. And the audience loved it and stood and applauded, and they had to play the last movement again. Well, that's never happened for a contemporary commission. But again, because it was about the people in that place. And we built a musical fence in Winton that is still there on the side of the first Qantas landing. And 20 carloads of people come every day and play the musical fence. And again, it's really creating something out of those places that are about those places that I think has lasting value and is of genuine importance. Yes, it's great to have something touring in, and they play, a one-night stand, but I've never thought one-night stands are particularly satisfying.
Oh,
And then
very cheap. That was a very cheap line.
But I think it's vitally important to create something in that place. So to answer Kelly's question, yes, it's about creating something there and developing it there. And, people have said, "Oh, well, you could do something in Orange." I said, "No, I don't want to do something in Orange. It's about doing it in Millthorpe." And that's what we'll do. We'll do it in Millthorpe, and we'll only do it in Millthorpe. We're not going to go to other places.
Karen, you're
Okay,
a
look-
semi-regional person. You can speak from experience.
Oh, look, I think those things are super important. That whole notion of the people, by the people, for the people. That literally word for word was the foundation of the Australian Elizabethan Theatre Trust in the 1950s. So that's essentially what we're after in the Australian arts sector. I think when I was listening to you, I was going, I love this so much, but, and the but is only if I'm thinking through economic rationalist lens of policymakers and so on, would be, but then what? You have this amazing product lasts for a couple of nights, everyone goes and sees it, they'll talk about it for years to come, but nobody else gets to experience that thing. And that's a problem in the arts. Like how do we actually get that long tail?
Well, because people travel now. And even with Mount Isa, we went back the following festival and did Bobcat Magic, and a similar sort of show, but it was about a guy who came to Mount Isa and had these magical powers. He could fix heavy machinery. Whoa! So he became a hero in the town. But people travelled to Mount Isa to see it. And the great thing about it was, and not only Mount Isa, but Rockhampton, Buckhall, and all these other places, they rang their relatives and said, why don't you come and see our show? We've got this fantastic show, Bobcat Dancing. And their relatives came. And they came to Mount Isa. And they came to Rockhampton. And I think that's a really important thing. I know with Opera at Millthorpe, people are coming from all over Australia already. It's already been talked about in the London Opera magazine and in the US and so on. But it's not about taking it somewhere else. It's about them coming to your place and also to answer the economic rationalists so the businesses in that town can do well. So that people, and I've deliberately, the show's in Millthorpe at 6 o'clock because there's a hatted restaurant next door so people can go to dinner at 8. Well, if you're in Sydney, you go to the show at 8 and at 10:30 or 11, you go out and everything's closed. You can't get anything to eat. So in Millthorpe you can. You can go next door or you can go to the pub or you can go to, there are 3 cellar doors within 50 metres of the hall. So it's about creating this thing where, yes, it's about making music at the highest level as well as you possibly can, but it's also about people coming into that place and spending money in that place so that the people who live there do well. And then you can go back to them and say, well, mate, you did well last year. What about throwing in a few bucks for the festival? And then you'll get something out of them. But, you need to prove yourself.
Karen, you've mentioned the economic rationalism. Let's get back to funding. You have written previously that arts companies in Australia are set up to fail by successive governments. What do you mean by that?
There's a couple of things going on there. So, first of all, I think if we go back to the 50s, the Australian Elizabethan Theatre Trust was set up to establish an Australian arts sector. And that was a distinct move away from the inherited British repertory companies that were here beforehand. And it was a conscious act to create our own symbolism in the arts. But it was only meant to provide seed funding until those organisations were up and running on their own. And of course that never happened. And one of the reasons why that never happened was what we call a cost disease or stable productivity. And what that means is that it effectively costs the same amount of money for an opera company, let's stick with opera, to produce a production for 100 people as it does for 10,000 people. So there's not a lot of chance to actually increase your profit depending on the size of your production. What it also encompasses is the idea of labour rises as well. So if we were to do Bobcat Dreaming again, you'd probably need to raise 3 or 4 times the amount of money to cover those costs.
There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, so the arts are constantly chasing their tail in terms of this revenue raising and in terms of delivering quality product. But what it also means in terms of economic rationalism and the policy cycle is that the arts can have promises made, we can have policies put into paper or not, it doesn't have to be written down, but they tend to get lost in a change of government. So we tend to find ourselves back at square one, and of course it's up to the government of the day to set those priorities. So one government might pledge a certain amount of money to something and the next government might come in and say, no way. So there's never a stable ground for the arts to actually find its feet and perhaps build on any momentum or any successes that they've had in the past.
How much...
Can I just ask, the consequence part of that argument, Karen, is the consequence, if the test isn't, eventually I want you to get an audience and to have people appreciate your art. If that's not the test, does that mean we just continue to fund everything? Or, where do you draw the line? Because there's not a never-ending budget. So who gets it and who doesn't on your model? That's
a really, really good question. So you referenced the 70s before, where we did have a lot of wild, wacky stuff come out, and we'll probably never see the day again other than a footnote in some history paper. But I think it's important that we're allowed to fail, because we find new writing styles, we find new voices, we find new personas or characters that we wouldn't have if we had this expectation of success or that we wanted to punish anything that didn't fail. So it's a really good question. We don't know who the next Kate Blanchett is going to be. So we need to kind of cast some funds widely at some point in that system so that everybody has an opportunity, if they want it, to have a go in that
Okay, look,
space.
we need to start wrapping it up, and we haven't touched on the issue of governance yet, which I wanted us to discuss. The role of the board, and we've seen some high-profile departures this year of artistic directors who have come in conflict with their
Falling
board.
from the sky, yeah.
Ian, what is the role of a board, and do our arts boards in this company need reforming?
Oh, sorry, can I jump in, Ian? Look, most boards, you just despair about them, frankly. It's, they shouldn't be there. And they make decisions based on...
Tell us what you really think. Come on, Lyndon, don't beat around the bush.
Based on, some ridiculous notion that they have that is completely wrong. I mean, my view is that in every arts organisation, the most important person is the artistic director. It is not the general manager. The general manager looks after the money in consultation with the artistic director. The artistic director can't just say, well, I'm going to, spend everything. But if they've got a good relationship, then it should work very well. And then the board stays out of it. When the board is interfering in something that they know nothing about, that's when you have some serious problems. And that problem is then compounded because they'll make another appointment that's even worse than the one that they made before.
Yes, but this all gets back to philanthropy too, doesn't it? We need the high-profile lawyers and bankers on our arts boards because they're the ones that bring in the philanthropic dollar.
I don't agree with that. I don't think they do. Look, people really want to spend money on a production or on a company if they believe in what it's doing artistically. I don't think it's got anything to do with the board. No one donates to a company because of the board. The board members may be able to say, look, you should have a chat to so-and-so, but if you've got a project that is incredibly exciting, inspiring, artistically wonderful, and you can explain it to a donor, then they'll put money in because of that, not because of the board and not because of the general manager.
I think there are two issues with boards at the moment, Kelly. One is that you do tend to have a board with a lawyer on it and an accountant and so on to cover the risk, because that's largely what the board is there to do, to govern and make sure that the risks are minimised. But one of the difficulties at the moment is there are so many risks, that you spend all your time, in my case, for example, looking at a youth orchestra, spend a hell of a lot of time on child safety issues. We've got a lot of kids under 18, and it's very important for us to keep them safe. We spend a lot of time on our reconciliation action plan. We spend a lot of time on workplace health and safety, kids not sitting in front of noisy trombones or not falling off risers as they, stand up to play the drums. And in the end, the last thing you spend time on is educating kids in good music. It is very difficult for a lot of boards at the moment to cover the field and still do what they've got to do. That's number one. I think number two is the point that Lyndon touched on. It is right that the board has no place really in the artistic direction of the company. But that's sort of easier said than done, Lyndon. Again, in our case at the youth orchestra, our charter is to educate the kids rather than to fill a hall. So, for example, the Queensland Symphony Orchestra's got to fill a hall, so it's got to put on popular repertoire that gets an audience. We don't care about that so much as giving the kids a good CV at the end of their time, that they've played, Mahler, that they've played Shostakovich, whatever. So it's more about, what they want to do. But by the same token, it's pretty dispiriting for them playing to an empty hall. So we say, as the board, to the musical director, well, look, we understand you've got to do that, but couldn't you broaden the artistic offering a bit, so that we fill the hall? Now that's a difficult, discussion, and it's he quite rightly says, look, mate, that's my purview. But it's not a clear black and white.
No,
I
I
don't know what you
think the
think,
battle
Karen,
between
from
the bean counters and the creatives is just the nature of
the beast.
of the job. Frank is wanting us to wrap up. Frank, do we have enough time for everyone to give a closing statement? I'm just wondering very quickly in 2 or less sentences, in this era of toxic social media and deep political division, is there a role of the arts to foster social cohesion?
I think that's the sort of role that if it sets out to do it, it won't do it. But if it sets out to do what it does well, then it will do it. So intentionally, no, I don't think it should have that on its agenda. But if it does if it plays good music or puts on good plays or puts on good circus, that will bring the community together simply because of the quality of the offering.
Karen?
Yeah, look, I think I agree. I think it's a consequence of the arts. I think that there's a big question mark if we go, the arts has to create social cohesion. But I think when the arts does the arts well, it brings people together and it's about having a shared experience. So that's social cohesion, I guess.
Look, I think from my perspective it relates to whether or not what we consider to be the important arts at the moment, like opera, ballet, symphony orchestras and so on, will remain relevant to our society. And maybe Creative Australia should be looking at what some rapper is doing in Blacktown or a company that's developing some sort of new Indian language play in Penrith or somewhere where, and look, these are just, crazy examples, but there may be a different sort of medium that needs to be supported and funded that could very well be an agent for creating a lot more social cohesion. Because in those western suburbs communities of Sydney, there are a lot of people from very, very different cultural backgrounds, and they're starting to create things musically and dramatically that relate to their existence, relate to their small community, but that community may grow, and that may mean that you have a lot more social cohesion than you do with, as we did with Opera Australia playing Parramatta.
Lyndon, Karen, Ian, thank you. And Fred, sorry for calling you Frank.
Join me, please, in if I had had my phone in my pants pocket, I would be in an excited state now. And nobody wants to see that because it's been buzzing the whole time with questions. So I don't know what the typical rate of intervention from the audience is, Mary, in our past dialogues, but you have really stimulated a lot of discussion. And I was going to say, as I approached the podium, they all came on nude. That was an ear-catching phrase. And I've been in a play where we all came on nude. And we only did it once because the police were going to shut us down if we did it again. So, but that was the 60s. It wasn't even the 70s. It was the 60s. Still available, Frank? Still available. But nobody wants to see that. So here's some questions from the audience, and I'll just throw them to you and answer them as you feel it has some connection with your interests or expertise. Social media has proven to be a product space for cultural expression and connection. What about the artistic expression happening on or facilitated by social media?
Yeah, valid point. I think that social media is, if we're going to talk in marketing terms, a threat to the arts in terms of eyeballs. I think it's absolutely valid means and method of being artistic and creative, and it's something that my students actually lean towards naturally, and I don't stop them. If that's the medium they want to work in, then they should be doing that. And I guess that comes back to this idea of the arts needs to evolve to continually meet new audiences.
Yeah, I think that's right. This is a little broader than social media per se, but at the moment, that by far the greatest consumer of new classical music is video games. And they are supporting more composers than any symphony orchestra around the world. So, yeah, the world is changing in that regard, and importantly so.
Yeah, I think too, if young people will of a certain X or Y, whatever generation it is, they all live on phones and they live on social media. So that's their whole world. And in terms of marketing, by far the best marketing tool if you're trying to sell a show now is through social media. Newspapers, sorry Kelly, you can put an ad in a newspaper, you don't sell any tickets. It's on social media, you sell a whole bunch.
I'm going to throw in another comment on that. I think another good thing about that, Ian, you just reminded me, is that field gives young artists an opportunity to earn money. They're out of the grant writing system, and I think that's a fantastic thing.
Yep.
But social media has also brought us artificial intelligence, which I think is a major threat to all creative industries, don't you think?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I really don't know enough about it other than to be scared of it. So that's probably a pretty bad start. But it's going to make a huge difference.
Sorry, Kelly.
I don't know. I don't know yet. I am worried about it a little bit, but I think at the end of the day, it's going to come down to people wanting what's authentic. We're not stupid as an audience. I think we can tell if a machine has written something or produced something. So I think that we might see a bit of a flurry. There might be a bit of excitement about what it can produce and what it can save us in terms of cost. But I think at the end of the day, we'll come back to having authentic storytellers.
Yeah, I was about to say that the social media is kind of a reflection of what we were talking about earlier about the 70s. And of course, there's a lot of absolute rubbish on social media. But I agree with Karen. I think ultimately, and who knows when that'll be, the cream will rise to the top. It always does, but it's knowing or trying to figure out when that will be.
A question to the panel. You haven't said anything about First Peoples arts. And where do they fit in the arts space in relation to some of the topics that you've been
Could I say something
canvassing?
about that? Earlier this week, I broke a story, and it was the one about Jamie Oliver, including a First Nations character in one of his children's books, and it was poorly researched and no consultation took place. I think we're now getting to the stage where we do not speak on behalf of First Nations people if we are not First Nations people, and maybe we should have had a First Nations person on this panel.
Yeah, look, I agree with that. I don't think it's, well, certainly I've done over 9 productions with First Nations people, and but I don't feel that I can speak for them or what they would want or how they would want it delivered.
I think it's an important part of the ecosystem. I don't think it should be overemphasised. I think it has its place. We have in Queensland the Cairns Indigenous Art Fair, which is a very important festival for us, bringing together Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art because Cairns is the perfect place to do that. I think there are some great and exciting areas in Indigenous art that are really opening up for us. One of them is fashion design, and there's some particular designers from Cairns who are doing materials in Indigenous designs that I think can well take the world by storm. So lots of blue sky there, but you're right, we can't really call that direction, but we can encourage it.
On public funding, the panel's largely focused on funding performances or companies or festivals. What about a role, and I guess there is such a role, for public funding of artists, that is, individual writers, composers, musicians?
Yes, I think that's really, really critical. Can I change my summary statement? We didn't speak about artists, so I didn't go to it, but I think if anything, the one thing that is super important moving forward is that we reconsider the status of the artist in Australia. It's always been terrible, absolutely terrible, and we need to elevate the artists. We need to make sure that they get what they need to survive. There's a huge amount of work being done overseas in terms of trialling the universal basic income, in terms of having advocacy bodies, in terms of having signed declarations supporting the status of the artist, and we are certainly trailing behind there. And I think if we're able to lift up artists, then not all the problems, not all the ills are going to go away, but I think it will go a little way to making some things better.
Karen, the centrality of the artist is one of the 5 pillars in the new cultural policy. Well, we're coming up to 2 years.
Yeah.
Have you seen any difference in what's happening out there?
Look, I mean, I gave no one asked, but I gave Revive 7.5 out of 10 earlier. And one of the reasons why is because we have seen, I might not get the name right, the Workplaces Council has been established and is up and running. They do produce webinars regularly. I believe they've started to produce some reports. But I think the 2.5, well, there's a few reasons, but I think there needs to be more reporting on how that policy is actually going in terms of how the government is rolling out those initiatives that they've put in there. I know over the past 10 years, the Australia Council's funding for individuals has dropped by 50%. So that's where we're going.
I think it's a dangerous path, funding individual artists, I must say. I think where expenditure and effort should go is into broader school-based arts education. In Queensland, for example, we've long had probably the best instrumental music program in the country, if not the world. Every child has access in a state school to learn a musical instrument. And that in turn has led to the quality of the Queensland Youth Orchestra that Lyndon spoke about, and in turn led to careers for so many. I think that's a better investment in money, be it music, be it in poetry, be it in drama. I think if you get that basics right, it doesn't solve the problem, and artists are still going to struggle. But I think otherwise, funding individual artists favours a few and lets a lot go through to the keeper, and I think that's a difficult decision. So I'm more inclined to have a broader based and better artistic education at school level.
I think if you're an artist, then you have to create. Otherwise, your life doesn't mean anything. You have to be desperate to create these things. There was no funding for Mozart, Beethoven, Puccini, Verdi, but they were desperate to create these things, so they did, and they sweated and sweated blood to make wonderful works of art. Look, I hate dragging out numbers all the time, but and I'm not sure what the numbers are now, but about 12, 13 years ago, I researched the numbers, and the Australia Council, since it was formed in 1973, had commissioned 173 operas by Australian composers. Not one has entered the repertoire. Not one. So there's something fundamentally wrong. There's something wrong with the system. It can't be that they're all not talented, but there's another issue, and I think that issue, whatever it is, that's what needs to be addressed. Maybe what Ian is saying is right. There were only a small number of them were funded and funded and funded, and maybe that was the wrong thing to do. I don't know, but when you've got that many and you don't have any success, I think you really need to look at it and say, well, something's not right.
One of the questioners asked, in fact, more than one, where is this being done well? And you might think, well, it's some other country, but maybe there's some other sector of Australian society where this is being done better than it's being done in the arts. So we mentioned sport before, but with that generality, is it being better done in Denmark, or is it being better done in football here in Australia? And what lessons can we learn from where it's being better done that would be applicable in a realistic kind of way to the arts sector?
I think it's really hard to compare because the arts are so different. Bourdieu said the arts were the opposite of economics because the laws that apply in other sectors just don't apply to the arts. If we're talking about sport, though, there's only 2 types of sport, of course, AFL and cricket. If you look at an AFL team,
That's the topic for the next conference, Fred.
If you look at an AFL team, those teams aren't just created. They are a team of individuals who have come up through tiny little 6-year-old leagues all the way up, and the investment has been in the individual player, not, I guess the teams get supported as well, of course, but if we weren't investing in that individual, we wouldn't have the Brisbane Lions. No AFL fans in here. You got
I
it.
agree.
Well done, yeah.
And look,
I'm a
that relates to
Broncos
what Ian
man,
was
but
saying
I
too.
take your point.
Apart from Queensland, where music education is fantastic, in the rest of Australia, there is none. And that is a huge issue. If there is an example where it works well, yes, it does work well in France, but it's all dependent on the government. If you're an actor in a play and the play finishes, well, you continue to get paid. You know, and that's so artists have an unofficial dole where they're paid. Well, you know, not many governments can afford to do that, and I don't think in the English-speaking world we would. Well, it would, to use a political term, it would probably fail the pub test.
Fred, I think it's important from that question not to go away with the thought that we think things are crook here. I don't think that at all. You know, Les Patterson, when asked about it, says, you know, they say we ain't got culture in Australia. We've got culture up to our, and it was something that rhymed with rissoles, but it was, we do have, you know, a great culture here. And I think something that you wrote, Lyndon, was, you know, can you imagine Sydney without the Opera House? And the answer is you can't. So, you know, it is much more ingrained in us than we probably like to admit. And therefore we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. It's not that we can't improve the situation, but you know, we've got a good thing going.
The idea that life changing is one of the effects of an encounter with the arts is one I think that everybody here has experienced in various measures. And if they're that important, if they're as important as, say, healthcare, well, we don't think there's anything odd about public funding of healthcare. We don't think that healthcare should depend on philanthropic, I mean, as it has indeed in other jurisdictions and in other historical periods. It's been entirely dependent on philanthropic contributions, but we don't think that anymore. So if there's a kind of a well-being aspect, a life-changing, a life-enhancing aspect, isn't it a good investment on the part of the government in terms of the health and well-being and of its populace, biopolitics, if you like?
Well, I would say absolutely, yeah. And there are plenty of studies that have been done about the effect of music in health and everything else, and also with kids at school studying music. It makes them better individuals. It makes them more rounded human beings. Music is very related to mathematics. You know, there are so many arguments that you can use, but unfortunately, I suspect, and again, thinking about it now, it probably relates to what Ian was saying. If people who are in politics now have had no education about music all through their school years, then you can't suddenly just turn a switch on and expect them to think, oh yeah, of course, yes, absolutely. I think it's a much more difficult thing than that. But, you know, Paul Keating heard Mahler and it changed his life.
Look, it is, all of that argument can be put, but you know, let's get down to the reality of what happens. When you're a Minister for the Arts, you go to a thing called CBRC, which is Cabinet Budget Review Committee, and you've got an expenditure proposal and 2 other ministers turn up with you in front of the committee to put the case. The other 2 ministers are the minister who's in charge of housing, who's got some money he wants the Treasurer to expend on the homeless that are living at the moment under bridges, and the other is someone who's looking at domestic violence and has got a program he wants the Treasurer to fund for that, and you've got your arts program. Now, you do your best and you put a great case, but they're the political decisions, you know, that have got to be made every day. There's not a limitless bucket of money, and where is that money going to go? So, you know, it does hit a sharp point at a certain point in time that politicians, the Treasurer, the Premier have got to make a decision about, you know, those competing interests. So, yep, you can put that argument, and it's a good argument to put. But as always, there are competing pressures on the Treasury, and you just got to put your best foot forward.
Yeah, if I could just pick up on that, I totally take Ian's point. I mean, if you're wandering around, I'm not sure what it's like in Canberra, but in Sydney, and you see the number of homeless people, and really disturbingly, in recent times, a lot of women that are homeless and living on the streets. It's a really upsetting sort of thing. And the fact that, you're running an opera festival in Millthorpe, you can't put your hand up and say, oh, and I'd like some money from government. By the way, I haven't done that, and I'm not asking money for government. It's when you see how people are living like that, it's, I just can't deal with that.
But I think the other side of the coin, Lyndon, is that there would probably never be a series of arguments in which the arts wouldn't be towards the bottom of the pile in those terms. So you do have to say at the beginning of the process, when the first budget is set, look, everyone agrees that it is an important part of the expenditure we're going to have to make. So you do have to have a figure locked in that you know you can rely on. But you've also probably got to know in your heart that it's going to be hard to go back with competing interests, because of those other stronger and competing things that you're going to have to
But
deal
I'm
with.
always very interested about why film seems to be quarantined by all of this, and particularly your Queensland government and under Campbell Newman when you were Arts Minister, where millions, possibly billions, is being ploughed into large Hollywood studios to come out here and make their films.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how can we find millions, if not billions of dollars to give to big Hollywood studios to make their movies here, and we can't fund a local music education program?
Yep. No, it's a good question, and I had to face it, exactly that. We had Pirates of the Caribbean come to...
60 million.
To the Gold Coast. But the argument there is that without those, we wouldn't be able to support for the rest of the year the set designers, the lighting guys, the production people and so on that go with those. So when you do the maths, the argument is that contribution that you're making to an external company is in fact driving those industries and setting those people up to a quality of performance that they wouldn't be able to achieve without that production in town. It still makes me cranky, and what I'd like is a sort of a moratorium on any government paying these people to come. But at the time, we did it. If we didn't front up with the dough, there were two other competitors. I think Victoria was one and Mexico was the other. So we would have lost it to those people and would have lost the business to all of those industries that hung off it. So it pains me to do it, but I think it's the right decision to do. It'd be nice if everyone got out of the business of funding film people that come to their state.
It's a race to the bottom, it
Correct.
seems.
Correct.
There is a bit of a silver lining that comes with those contracts, and one of them is that as part of the contract, the film production company has to employ a certain number of locals, and that is incredibly important for skills capacity building. So we have 19-year-olds on a major movie set learning makeup, learning show running, making props. So that goes on their CV, and all of a sudden they are more employable for hopefully the next local production.
And you do other deals. There was a deal on that there was a Queensland tourism promotion every time the film was shown around the world. So there is a quid pro quo, but you're quite right in raising it. It's not a nice part of what you've got to do, but I think at the moment you've got to play that game.
Sharing stories, entertaining one another, securing our well-being, changing our lives. It's nice to be reminded of this. I mean, I think we take the arts for granted if we're involved, if they play a part in our own lives. We put the CD, the DVD in the machine. We're transformed or transported. And Australia does punch above its weight. It was one of the privileges that I had as a new Australian here in Canberra was that every weekend in University House, at the height of the Australian new wave of cinema, Ralph Elliott, a fellow of the Academy of the Humanities, would show a 16mm print of a new Australian movie. And it was a wonderful way to be inducted into Australian culture. So we've had our little golden age. We've had a golden age in opera. We've had a golden age in pop music. We've had a golden age in literature. And we need to keep feeding the roots. And that's the conclusion that I draw from this conversation. And it will be always a question of balance, because everything's a question of balance. Who pays the piper calls the tune. If the audience is paying the piper, then they're calling the tune. And you get what you get when you fund art that way. If the philanthropists are paying the piper, then they'll call the tune, or at least influence how the tune is played. And similarly for the government. So it's going to be a balancing act, and people who are in the position of Ian and Lyndon are constantly having to balance those competing interests. And we've seen I think the most valuable thing for me tonight, anyway, and I won't speak for the rest of you, is to get a sense, having opened up the hood of the car, as it were, of how complex the machinery is and how many trade-offs need to be made and how many considerations need to be taken into account in order to think rationally about these things. There's been no Boffo conclusion, no curtain, raiser, showstopper conclusion from tonight's discussion, but there's been a lot of points for all of us to reflect on and to perhaps discuss with our Member of Parliament or discuss with our local Mr. Moneybags or Ms. Moneybags, and to discuss with our peers and get them to go along to the museum or the opera or the pop show or whatever it happens to be. I'm sorry that Les Patterson wasn't able to be here tonight. If I'd exercised a little bit more kind of thoughtfulness about this, I could easily have dressed up as Les Patterson. I spill food on myself. I love the arts. I could drip tobacco from my cigar on my vest. I think I could have managed it, and I'm really sorry. This was a missed opportunity. So you'll just have to come back again some other time to see us all perform the Les Patterson show. So thank you. I'm going to thank the panel on your behalf, and I do hope you'll join me in thanking them. I was so happy when we assembled this group, but you never know. Remember the line from Shakespeare in Love, it'll all come together on the night. Well, it all came together on the night. So thank you one and all. And join me in thanking our panel. Now, in the immortal words of Elwood Blues, you don't have to go home, but and I won't put it as crudely as he did in the country bunker scene from the Blues Brothers, but you can't stay here. I think the management would like you to slowly and at your own pace drift somewhere else. And there are bars and restaurants and whatnot downstairs, and I hope that you'll give them your custom if you haven't anything better to do. And in the meantime, I thank you on behalf of the Australian Academy of the Humanities and Australian Dialogues. And I'll make sure that the participants get all of the comments. I think I got about half of them to the group, but there's still plenty of other comments and questions for them to see. So thank you one and all, and good evening. It's absolutely terrific.